The Fourth Way Up. Chapter 10. Interaction of the Centers, the Magnetic Center, and False Crystallization. Interaction of the Centers. For a complete understanding of the interaction of the centers of the psyche with each other, let us consider the diagram below. We warn you right away that this diagram is somewhat conditional and intended only to explain some aspects of the center's interaction. We are talking about one of the diagrams that connect the centers. We are not talking about the actual structure of the system of centers here. It is very indicative to see the center's interaction using several diagrams of the second expansion of the law of three. This diagram shows that the emotional center plays the leading role in the interaction of centers. It connects other centers in one way or another, creating various forms of consciousness. Each type of human activity requires a specific structure connecting the centers. The diagram shows the centers, 5 lower and 2 higher. In the lower centers, the letters show the parts of the centers. E is emotional, A is automatic, and I is intellectual. The emotional part of the emotional center has an artificial AN and natural NN department of negative emotions. HI is the higher intellectual center. HE is the higher emotional center. The lower centers communicate with each other through the emotional parts. The emotional center is depicted as the large central rectangle. At the bottom of the rectangle are shown the departments of natural and artificial negative emotions. At the top, through the intellectual part, the emotional center interacts with the higher emotional center, which in turn contacts the higher intellectual center. Studying the configurations of the center's interaction, you can see that there is a vast range of states of consciousness from very high to very low. So, if the intellectual parts of all the lower centers are connected to each other, this is the highest state of consciousness for an undeveloped person, i.e., for a man number 1, 2, 3. If the automatic parts of 2 centers, emotional and instinctive, are connected, this is the lowest state of consciousness of the individual. This may happen during a loss of consciousness, due to an accident. It is impossible to describe the enormous diversity of such forms of consciousness in this book. However, one should note that studying an individual's predominant forms of consciousness allows us to determine their level of development. It is clear that each type of essence, as well as the number of a person, is characterized by using a particular set of forms of consciousness. In accordance with a person's upbringing, he has some imbalance in the development of centers. Analysis of this state of affairs helps to choose the best options for working on oneself. Internal disharmony is an obstacle to the development of consciousness. For example, an individual is highly developed emotionally, but intellectually he is weak. This will lead to blind faith. Further overdevelopment of the emotional center may lead to failures in other centers, for example, in the sexual center. This individual, in accordance with his perverse understanding of faith in God, will declare celibacy. Sexual abstinence will lead to an excess of energy in the sexual center and its entry into the emotional center. A certain kind of obsession will arise, fanatical missionary work. It is clear that to achieve harmony, this student needs to develop the intellectual center. In the opposite case, overdevelopment of the intellectual center, a person will be inclined to fruitless philosophizing. A person will be full of information, but not understanding due to a lack of emotional perception of that information. Such knowledge will be dead in this individual. Gurdjieff called such people weak yogis. They can explain everything, but can do nothing. In a school of the fourth way, of course, such a philosopher will be offered methods for developing the emotional center. After harmonizing the center's work and neutralizing the false personality, which we will discuss later, the main direction of development will be the creation of a corresponding configuration of consciousness, leading to the activation of higher centers. The main thing in this process will be the formation of conscious and sincere faith. Such a program, aimed at harmonizing the lower and higher centers, faith in God, is formed in the intellectual part of the emotional center. This is not blind faith, which is in the emotional part of the emotional center, close to fanaticism, but a completely conscious and clear aspiration combined with self-remembering. Gurdjieff said, "Faith of the body is a disease, faith of emotions is stupidity, faith of consciousness is freedom." This means that in the first case, all of a person's attention is riveted to the needs of the body. Such an individual is a slave to the body. Gluttony, laziness, stupidity, and lust are the lot of this creature. In the second case, identification with desires and emotions makes a person resemble a ship without a rudder and a sail, sinking in a raging ocean. In the third case, conscious faith in God and activation of the higher centers gives the addition of a clear understanding of the goal and the desire to achieve it. Such faith connects the higher and lower centers and leads to new, beautiful states of consciousness. This faith results from a real perception of divine love and grace by the essence of a person working on himself. The one who has cognized this has no doubts. There is no element of trust here. Here is a direct feeling and understanding of the fact of God's manifestation. A person who has realized the higher states of consciousness has really achieved the immortality of his consciousness. The magnetic center. The magnetic center is a stable information structure inside the emotional parts of the intellectual, emotional, and motor centers, directing a person to develop a higher consciousness. At the bioinformational level, the magnetic center plays the role of a kind of radio compass that picks up the radiation of people with interests close to one's own and subconsciously orients the individual to a meeting with them. A newly incarnated person with a magnetic center will unconsciously look for people with the same essential interests. The magnetic center forms at the moment of switching on the higher centers. If this was the internal work of a person in some tradition, in some life, then the person's magnetic center in this life will look for radiation of people close or identical to his vibrations. Usually, the emotional center is the most developed, the intellectual center is less developed, and the motor center is even less developed. However, if a person's motor center is more developed than other centers, it can become the main one in the development of consciousness. Such a person is not stupid at all. It is just that the motor center is his strong point. While working on himself, this individual will develop the ability to dictate the will of the motor center to the emotional and intellectual centers. This is the path of will. As a strong emotion, will is produced by a structure located in the emotional part of the motor center. That structure is the magnetic center of the fakir. Will is a real value obtained by such a fakir. In addition, he acquires the ability to perceive the world and influence it by means of tentacles coming from the solar plexus, the projection zone of the motor center. For ancient hunters and warriors, such probes were absolutely necessary for survival. An untrained person does not have such abilities. The fakir has developed an astral body, but his consciousness is limited. He will retain the same consciousness after death. Several times, we had to observe people who remembered motion-based systems of self-development in detail and demonstrated them with amazing perfection. Moreover, these people have never even been interested in these systems before. After a new birth, the fakir will continue his mission, limited by the consciousness of the motor center. We can say that the fakir goes straight, like a stone through water, but it is not known where and why he goes. He is a living stone. The fakir is strong and durable, but he has neither developed thinking nor love for God, life, and people. As observations show, the fakir can carry elements of false crystallization into the next life. Quoting his teacher, Don Juan, Carlos Castaneda says that all paths lead to nowhere. How accurately this is said for the fakir. His paths really do not lead anywhere. If a person's emotional center is more developed than other centers, then this person is inclined to religion, to the path of a monk. This is the path of faith. Such a monk loves to pray, but does not want or cannot think. Thinking is difficult for him due to the underdevelopment of the intellectual center. One can often notice that these people read little and with difficulty, slowly. To the difficult questions they come across, they answer, "This is how God arranged it," or meaningfully, "This is a great mystery." The teaching of the fourth way is too abstruse for a monk, and even more so for a fakir. As befits such a monk, temptations and the devil in any form are constantly waiting everywhere. In some cases, this person is too emotionally open. In others, he is constrained and unable to see anything except memorized dogmas. Jesus Christ seriously scolded such scribes and Pharisees. Such individuals see reality only from one side, which is the weakness of their consciousness. It is easy to confuse such a creature because his intellectual center is weak. In addition, he constantly lacks the will to fight passions. He should live in a monastery. And if we evaluate the activities of religious fanatics in general, they cause significant harm to their religious denomination and, as history has shown many times, discredit the best teachings. The teaching of the fourth way is also subject to strong distortions by the fanatics of the fourth way. But not everything is so bad. A real monk knows how to pray correctly. He has a powerful faith. The faith of a monk is not an intellectual trust, but a positive emotion that mobilizes the body's reserves. Such an emotion is produced by the magnetic center, a structure located in the emotional part of the emotional center of the monk. The prayer of such a person is the voice that God hears. Of course, one must combine true faith with sincere love for God. Unfortunately, in religious teachings, the positive emotion of love for God is often replaced by the negative emotion of fear of God. Combining two positive emotions, love and faith, gives a real expansion of consciousness, illumination, and enlightenment. However, if positive and negative emotions, faith and fear, are combined, this leads to a narrowing of consciousness, to fanaticism. The result will be incorrect work of the centers with all the ensuing consequences. If a person has a strong intellectual center, he can follow the path of knowledge. Raja and Jnana Yoga are examples of this path. A person following the path of knowledge is characterized by a strong desire to know the world and life. He wants to understand where he came from and where he is going. What is life and what is the world? This strong desire to know is generated by the magnetic center, located in the emotional part of the intellectual center of the yogi. In Raja Yoga, a person learns to separate his I from the body, feelings, emotions, and thoughts. However, the I that separates is one of many I's, and when it stops acting, intervals arise, and other I's come into play. Intellectual programs formed by certain eyes of the emotional, sexual, instinctive, and motor centers can enter the intervals. The original direction is distorted. The intellectual center fights with other centers that contain few programs interested in self-development. The same picture of the war with low conscious centers exists on other paths of self-improvement. Raja and Jnana yogis accumulate a large amount of knowledge, which they cannot implement due to a low level of development of the motor, no will, and emotional, no faith centers. They do not understand what they know. They cannot use their knowledge. About the correlation of yogic practices, they say, the one who practices Hatha Yoga but does not know Raja Yoga wastes time in vain. The one who practices Raja Yoga but does not know Bhakti Yoga wastes time in vain. Lack of knowledge on the path of the fakir and monk leads to the formation of a stupid saint who has the ability to do and does not know what he needs to do. Lack of the ability to do, in the terminology of the fourth way, being with an excess of knowledge is the reason for the appearance of a weak yogi who cannot do anything serious. Each of the three paths suffers from its one-sidedness. The fourth way unites the three previous paths with the help of self-remembering. If the fakir's motto is do, the monk's motto is believe, the yogi's motto is know. Then the motto of the fourth way follower is know, believe, and do, fully aware of yourself. The desire to be aware of yourself, the magnetic center of an adept of the fourth way, is in the intellectual part of the emotional center. Even if the yogi, fakir, and monk achieve the activation of higher centers, they often get into danger of narrowed consciousness, trance. At this point, a teacher who will lead the student to a high level of consciousness is absolutely necessary. Trance does not give the student anything useful. Such a state does not give neither knowledge, understanding, or the ability to do. Magnetic centers located in the emotional center have some advantages over other similar structures. People number 1, 2, 3, and 4 after death lose all centers unrelated to the essence. The memory of the structures crystallized in the emotional parts of the centers is preserved, in essence. But these are not the magnetic centers themselves, but only the memory of them. In contrast, the magnetic center of a person of the fourth way is located directly in the essence, i.e., it is directly connected with the higher centers. Such a structure has gravitation towards self-development even in a subtle material state, i.e., this spirit seeks knowledge. The magnetic center of an adept of the fourth way has another advantageous feature from the point of view of opening the higher centers. It is located in the intellectual part of the emotional center, which is directly connected with the higher emotional center. That is, it has the closest connection with the higher centers. A student of the fourth way achieves the opening of the higher centers faster and easier than anyone else. False crystallization. Structures of false crystallization are somewhat similar to magnetic centers. A person can be so immersed in ideas and emotions of revenge, enrichment, power, and glory that these intentions can create a strong structure in the emotional parts of certain centers. Such a frantic intention subjugates all other centers, and often an individual achieves his goal. However, this is where the inadequacy of his aspirations is revealed. Yes, the person has taken revenge. Yes, there is an incalculable amount of money. Yes, the pinnacle of power has been reached. But what next? This individual cannot do anything else. He is strictly specialized and is not capable of developing. We had to observe a woman who was so immersed in earning money that she had significantly more than she could spend in her entire life. she could easily live on bank interest alone. This woman got breast cancer, which, by the way, was not accidental given her family relationships. The race for money alienated her from her children and her husband. She began to be treated by a good healer. A good improvement occurred. The tumor had almost disappeared. It was necessary to continue the treatment until the victorious end. But the woman suddenly remembered that she had not earned money for 6 months, but only spent money, and the race for money began again. Then a new exacerbation of the disease and a new successful stage of treatment arose. Then the cycle repeated itself once more. However, cancer is not a runny nose. This woman began the climacteric period when hormonal changes occurred, and the oncological process passed into an irreversible stage. Even the threat of death did not stop the making of money. The day before her death, she said that she realized her mistake. This gives hope, but does not mean at all that she will not transfer the desire for profit into the next life. People with false crystallization often achieve great success in their activities. They, like correctly crystallized people, number 5, write books, but unlike the ideas of harmonious development, they promote their pathological one-sidedness. These are strong appeals, similar to the influence of B, but they do not aim at developing consciousness. These are the influences of A. Gurdjieff called people with false crystallization hasnamasses. He wrote that hasnamasses go to their goal, using any means and not thinking about the suffering they cause to other people.